"You belong in my bed tonight," the giant cowboy whispered to the shivering nun. The desert wind howled through Crosswinds like a banshee as Marcus Bull Coleman towered over the trembling figure before him. At 6 feet 8 inches, his massive frame cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Sister Catherine Morrison pulled her woolen cloak tighter, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid Nevada air. What had started as a cruel wager in the Silver Dollar Saloon had led to this moment, where two unlikely souls would discover that fate sometimes disguises blessings as curses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across the weathered walls of the Silver Dollar Saloon as the autumn wind rattled the windows. Crosswinds had seen better days, but tonight the establishment buzzed with unusual energy. Word had spread through the mining town that Vincent Blackwood was hosting another of his legendary poker games, the kind where fortunes changed hands and men either walked away wealthy or crawled away broken. Marcus Coleman sat hunched over his cards, his enormous hands making the playing pieces look like children's toys. The gentle giant had earned his nickname Bull not from any aggressive nature, but from his sheer size and the way he moved with surprising grace despite his massive frame. Tonight desperation had driven him to the poker table, something that went against every instinct in his normally cautious soul. His prize stallion, Thunder, had broken a leg that morning, and without a horse, a cowboy might as well be a man without legs. The veterinarian's bill alone would cost more than Bull made in 2 months working the cattle drives between Crosswinds and Carson City. Across the green felt table, Vincent Blackwood studied his opponent with predatory interest. Blackwood owned most of the profitable land around Crosswinds, having arrived 5 years earlier with mysterious wealth and an appetite for acquisition that seemed boundless. His perfectly waxed mustache and expensive Eastern clothing marked him as an outsider, but his ruthless business practices had quickly established his dominance over the local economy. Tonight he'd watched with growing irritation as the quiet cowboy had methodically won hand after hand, his honest face betraying nothing while his steady nerves proved unshakable. The other players had folded out hours ago, leaving only Bull and Blackwood to face off in what had become a battle of wills as much as cards. The pot contained more money than most residents of Crosswinds saw in a year, including the deed to a small but profitable silver claim that Blackwood had thrown in during the 4th hour of play. Bull had matched it with his savings, his horse trailer, and the modest cabin he'd built with his own hands on the outskirts of town. Bull examined his cards with the same patience he used when breaking wild horses. 3 queens smiled back at him, a hand strong enough to feel confident about, but not so overwhelming as to make him reckless. He'd learned poker during his years riding with cattle drives where cowboys whiled away long evenings around campfires testing their luck against each other. Unlike many players, Bull had never developed a taste for bluffing or elaborate deception. His strategy relied on reading people honestly and playing his cards straightforwardly, an approach that had served him well tonight. Blackwood's fingers drummed against the table as he calculated his options. The land speculator had expected to dominate this backwater poker game, using his superior education and sophisticated understanding of probability to fleece the local rubes. Instead he found himself facing a significant loss to a man he'd previously dismissed as another simple-minded ranch hand. The humiliation stung worse than the financial setback, especially with half the town watching from the bar and nearby tables. The saloon crowd pressed closer as the tension reached its peak. Miners still covered in copper dust from their shifts rubbed shoulders with ranch hands and shopkeepers, all eager to witness what promised to be a memorable conclusion to the evening's entertainment. Murphy, the Irish bartender, had stopped serving drinks to watch the showdown unfold. Even the working girls had abandoned their usual evening routines to gather around the poker table. Bull's weathered face remained impassive as he waited for Blackwood's decision. Years of working outdoors had carved deep lines around his eyes and left his skin permanently bronzed by the desert sun. His calloused hands, accustomed to handling reins and ropes, held the cards with surprising delicacy. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd earned his living through honest labor, making his presence at a high-stakes poker game seem almost surreal. Blackwood reached for his wallet, then hesitated. His cash reserves had been depleted during the earlier rounds of betting, and his pride prevented him from backing down in front of so many witnesses. The land baron's reputation for always finding a way to win had become part of his mystique in Crosswinds, and losing to a common cowboy would undermine the carefully cultivated image of invincibility that helped him intimidate business rivals. A cruel smile slowly spread across Blackwood's features as inspiration struck. He'd noticed the nun earlier that evening, sitting alone in the corner booth where she'd been nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. Sister Catherine Morrison had arrived in Crosswinds 3 weeks earlier, sent by the territorial diocese to establish a mission school for the growing number of families settling in the area. Her presence had been a source of curiosity and mild controversy, as many residents weren't sure what to make of a Catholic nun in their predominantly Protestant community. Well now Coleman, Blackwood announced loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear, seems I'm running a bit short on ready cash. His voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd received Eastern schooling, a reminder of the social gulf that separated him from most Crosswinds residents. But I've got something else that might interest a lonely cowboy like yourself. The saloon fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant howl of wind through the mountains. Bull shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing that whatever Blackwood was about to propose would cross lines that decent men didn't cross. He glanced toward the corner booth where Sister Catherine sat reading her breviary by lamplight, seemingly oblivious to the attention suddenly focused in her direction. That nun over yonder, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the theatrical quality of a carnival barker, she's been looking for lodging since she arrived. Housing situation in this town being what it is, she's been sleeping in the chapel storage room like some kind of vagrant. The land baron's words dripped with false concern. I happen to own the boarding house she inquired about, and I could arrange for her to have proper accommodations. Or better yet, given your recent good fortune, perhaps she could benefit from the personal protection of Crosswind's most successful cowboy this evening. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Most of the men seemed uncomfortable with where Blackwood's proposal was heading. Bull's jaw tightened as he began to understand the true nature of what was being suggested. His reputation as a gentleman had never been questioned during his 5 years in Crosswinds, and the idea of being associated with anything improper toward a woman of God filled him with revulsion. She's a nun, Blackwood, Bull said quietly, his deep voice carrying clearly in the hushed saloon. That ain't proper talk about a lady, especially one devoted to religious service. Blackwood waved dismissively, enjoying the moral discomfort he was creating. Oh come now Coleman, we're all men of the world here. The woman needs shelter from the cold, and you've got a warm cabin with plenty of room. I'm simply suggesting a practical arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. His eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Besides, who's to say what's proper when survival is at stake? These mountain nights get mighty cold and Christian charity demands we look after those in need. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a bad cigar, tainting everything it touched. Bull could feel the weight of every gaze in the saloon pressing down on him, waiting to see how he would respond to such an outrageous proposal. Some faces showed disgust at Blackwood's crudeness, while others displayed the ugly curiosity of people eager to witness scandal unfold. Sister Catherine looked up from her reading, having finally noticed the unusual silence that had fallen over the normally boisterous establishment. Her intelligent brown eyes quickly assessed the situation, taking in the poker table, the expectant faces, and the tension crackling between the two main players. Though she couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged, years of working in difficult environments had taught her to recognize when she was becoming the subject of unwelcome attention. I don't think you understand the nature of religious vows, Mr. Blackwood, Bull replied, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. And I don't appreciate you dragging an innocent woman into your gambling schemes. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, savoring the moral superiority he believed his education and wealth granted him over the simple cowboy. Innocent? My dear Coleman, you have such a quaint view of the world. The woman chose to come to this God-forsaken wilderness, knowing full well the hardships she'd face. If she's truly as virtuous as her costume suggests, then spending a night under your roof should present no challenges to her moral fiber. Unless of course you're suggesting that your own character might be questionable. The verbal trap was expertly laid. By questioning Bull's ability to behave honorably around Sister Catherine, Blackwood had created a situation where refusing the wager might be interpreted as an admission of improper intentions. The land baron understood human psychology well enough to know that pride often forced good men into bad decisions, and he was counting on Bull's reputation as a gentleman to work against him. Bull studied his cards again, trying to find a way out of the impossible situation Blackwood had created. The three queens still smiled up at him, promising victory if he could just find the courage to call the bet. But the stakes had shifted from money and property to something far more precious and dangerous. The very idea of involving Sister Catherine in their gambling dispute made his stomach churn, even if Blackwood's proposal was couched in terms of providing shelter rather than anything more sinister. The crowd began murmuring among themselves as the silence stretched on. Murphy wiped down glasses behind the bar with unnecessary vigor, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the evening had taken. Several of the more respectable patrons had already begun making their way toward the door, unwilling to be associated with whatever was about to unfold. "What exactly are you proposing?" Bull asked finally, though he already suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. Blackwood's smile widened as he sensed victory approaching. "Simple hospitality, Coleman. The sister needs a warm place to sleep tonight, and Christian duty suggests we should provide for those in need. I'm merely suggesting that if you win this hand, you'll be in a position to offer such charity. And if you lose, well, I suppose she'll have to make do with whatever arrangements she can manage on her own." The cruelty of the proposal was breathtaking in its calculated malice. Blackwood had managed to frame his suggestion in terms that made refusing seem selfish and unchristian, while accepting carried implications that no honorable man would willingly embrace. It was the kind of verbal manipulation that had made him successful in business and despised by almost everyone who dealt with him personally. Bull looked across the saloon toward Sister Catherine, who had returned her attention to her breviary, but remained alert to the undercurrents of tension flowing through the room. Even from a distance he could see the intelligence in her posture and movements, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the challenging circumstances of her situation. The idea of reducing such a woman to the subject of a gambling wager filled him with shame, even though he hadn't initiated the proposal. "That's enough," Bull said, starting to push back from the table. "I won't be part of treating any woman like property, especially not a nun. Keep your money, Blackwood. Some games ain't worth playing." But Blackwood had anticipated this response and was ready with his final manipulation. "How noble of you, Coleman," he said loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear. "Though I wonder what Sister Catherine will think when she learns that your moral sensitivity cost her a warm bed tonight. The chapel storage room gets mighty cold when the wind picks up, and I hear there's a storm coming down from the mountains." The words hit their target perfectly. Bull glanced toward the windows where he could indeed see signs of an approaching weather front. The autumn nights in the Nevada mountains could be brutally cold, and the thought of Sister Catherine spending another night in the unheated storage room while he walked away from a winning hand began to eat at his conscience. Blackwood pressed his advantage. "Of course, if you're confident in your hand and your ability to behave like a gentleman, then you'd actually be helping the good sister by winning. Christian charity and all that, unless you're afraid you might lose to a better player." The challenge was perfectly calculated to exploit Bull's natural protectiveness and his pride in his poker skills. Blackwood had managed to reframe the entire situation so that walking away seemed like abandoning Sister Catherine to unnecessary hardship, while playing seemed like the charitable thing to do. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that played on every decent instinct Bull possessed. Bull looked at his cards one more time, then at the expectant faces surrounding the table. The weight of decision pressed down on him like a physical burden, made heavier by the knowledge that whatever choice he made would have consequences far beyond the outcome of a simple card game. In the distance he could hear the first rumble of thunder as the promised storm began its approach toward Crosswinds. "All right, Blackwood," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "One hand, winner takes all." The die was cast and neither man could have predicted how profoundly this moment would change not just their own lives, but the entire character of Crosswinds itself. The cards felt heavier in Bull's massive hands as the weight of his decision settled over the Silver Dollar Saloon like a funeral shroud. Every eye in the establishment remained fixed on the poker table, waiting to witness what would surely become the most talked-about hand in Crosswinds history. The storm outside had begun in earnest, with rain pelting the windows and thunder rolling across the desert mountains like the drumbeat of approaching doom. Bull's internal struggle played out across his weathered features as he wrestled with the impossible choice Blackwood had forced upon him. His every instinct as a decent man screamed against involving Sister Catherine in their gambling dispute, yet the practical reality of her situation gnawed at his conscience like a persistent ache. The chapel storage room where she'd been sleeping was little more than a closet with stone walls, offering no protection against the kind of storm that was now building outside. Blackwood watched his opponent's moral turmoil with the satisfaction of a chess master who had cornered his opponent's king. The land baron understood human nature well enough to know that good men were often easier to manipulate than bad ones, their very decency becoming a weapon that could be turned against them. He'd spent years perfecting the art of presenting selfish desires as noble gestures, and tonight's performance represented the culmination of his psychological expertise. The crowd's mood had shifted from festive gambling excitement to something darker and more uncomfortable. Men who had come to the saloon for simple entertainment now found themselves witnesses to a moral drama that would force them to examine their own characters. Some shifted nervously in their boots, while others leaned forward with the ugly fascination of spectators at a public execution. Murphy, the Irish bartender, had stopped all pretense of working and stood frozen behind the bar, his weathered hands gripping a glass so tightly his knuckles had turned white. 20 years of serving drinks in frontier establishments had shown him every variety of human cruelty and kindness, but something about tonight's wager struck him as particularly poisonous. The way Blackwood had wrapped his crude proposition in the language of Christian charity represented a new low even by the standards of frontier gambling. Jake Morrison, the wagon wheel ranch foreman, pushed through the crowd to get a better view of the proceedings. Unbeknownst to most of the assembled men, Sister Catherine was his younger sister, though they'd been estranged for nearly a decade since she'd chosen religious life over the marriage their father had arranged. Jake's face had gone pale when he realized his sister had become the subject of Blackwood's wager, but social pressures and his own complicated feelings about her choices kept him silent. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turbulence building within the saloon. Lightning illuminated the windows in brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that shook the building's foundations. The temperature had dropped dramatically with the approaching weather front, and several men unconsciously glanced toward the corner where Sister Catherine sat, knowing that her current lodging would offer little protection against such a night. Sister Catherine herself had become aware that she was the focus of intense attention, though the specific nature of the discussion at the poker table remained unclear to her. Years of working in hostile environments had taught her to recognize when her presence was unwelcome or controversial, and the charged atmosphere in the saloon suggested that her mere existence was somehow complicating matters for others. She closed her breviary and prepared to leave, unwilling to be the cause of conflict among the townspeople she'd come to serve. Bull noticed her movement and felt another twist of guilt in his chest. The sight of her gathering her modest belongings to venture out into the storm, rather than remain where she might be causing problems, demonstrated the kind of selfless consideration that made Blackwood's wager even more obscene. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to serving others, and men were discussing her as if she were a prize to be won or lost at cards. Blackwood sensed the shift in the room's energy and decided to press his advantage before sympathy for Sister Catherine could undermine his psychological manipulation. He leaned forward with the practiced gestures of a man accustomed to closing difficult deals, his voice taking on the persuasive cadence that had convinced dozens of desperate landowners to sell their properties at below-market prices. "Time grows short, Coleman," Blackwood announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The storm is worsening, and Christian charity demands we think of those less fortunate than ourselves. Surely a man of your reputation for kindness wouldn't allow pride to prevent him from offering shelter to someone in need." His words carried the subtle implication that refusing to play was tantamount to abandoning Sister Catherine to the elements. Several men in the crowd began nodding unconsciously, caught up in Blackwood's rhetorical trap without fully understanding how they were being manipulated. The land baron had masterfully reframed the entire situation so that Bull's natural reluctance to treat a woman as gambling stakes appeared selfish rather than decent. It was the kind of verbal sleight of hand that had made Blackwood wealthy and influential throughout the territory. Bull felt the pressure of expectant gazes pressing down on him like a physical weight. In a community where reputation meant everything and social ostracism could destroy a man's livelihood, the appearance of callousness towards Sister Catherine's welfare could have consequences extending far beyond a single evening's gambling. Ranch owners who employed him might question his character, shopkeepers might become less willing to extend credit, and the intricate web of mutual dependence that held frontier communities together might begin unraveling around him. The internal war between Bull's conscience and practical considerations played out in the tense silence that followed Blackwood's challenge. His moral instincts recoiled at the thought of reducing Sister Catherine to the stakes in a card game, yet his protective nature demanded that he ensure her safety during the approaching storm. The conflicting impulses created a psychological paralysis that Blackwood was counting on to force the desired decision. Young Tommy Chen, who worked as a clerk at the general store, whispered urgently to his wife Sarah about the unusual tension in the normally jovial saloon. The couple had arrived only minutes earlier, seeking shelter from the storm, and found themselves thrust into the middle of a moral drama they didn't fully understand. Sarah's face showed genuine concern for Sister Catherine, whom she'd met briefly at the general store, and found to be both kind and intelligent. The nun in question had risen from her corner booth, and was making her way toward the saloon's exit, moving with the quiet dignity that characterized all her actions. Her simple traveling dress and practical boots marked her as someone accustomed to hardship rather than comfort, while her posture conveyed the inner strength that had enabled her to undertake missionary work in the challenging frontier environment. As Sister Catherine passed near the poker table, several conversations died away, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Her presence seemed to highlight the moral dimensions of what was taking place, forcing men to confront the gap between their stated values and their actual behavior. Some looked away in shame, while others studied her with curious intensity, as if trying to understand what kind of woman would choose such a difficult life. Bull watched her approach the door, and felt something break loose inside his chest. The sight of her preparing to walk out into the storm, rather than remain where she might be causing trouble for others, crystallized his understanding of her character in a way that hours of observation couldn't have achieved. Here was someone who consistently chose others' comfort over her own, even when those others had shown her little kindness or welcome. "Sister," Bull called out, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise of the saloon. "Storm's getting worse out there. Might be safer to wait it out here where it's warm and dry." Sister Catherine turned toward him with a slight smile that managed to convey both gratitude and gentle reproach. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Coleman, but I wouldn't want to impose on the establishment's hospitality longer than necessary. I'm sure the chapel will provide adequate shelter." Her response demonstrated both her awareness of the social tensions her presence created, and her unwillingness to be the cause of conflict among community members. The grace with which she handled an obviously uncomfortable situation impressed even some of the men who had been skeptical about having a Catholic nun in their predominantly Protestant town. Blackwood seized on the moment with predatory instinct. "You see, Coleman, the good sister is prepared to face the elements rather than accept charity from those who might help her. Unless, of course, you're willing to ensure she has proper shelter tonight by trusting in your card-playing abilities and Christian generosity." The manipulation was so blatant that several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand how they were being used as unwitting accomplices in Blackwood's psychological coercion. Yet the social dynamics of the situation had gained momentum beyond any individual's ability to control, creating a scenario where backing down would require someone to admit publicly that they'd been party to something inappropriate. Bull looked once more at his cards, then at Sister Catherine's face, then at the expectant crowd surrounding the table. The 3 queens in his hand represented the strongest holding he'd seen all evening, offering an excellent chance of victory if he could summon the courage to play. His mathematical mind calculated the odds automatically, suggesting that accepting Blackwood's wager would likely result in Sister Catherine's benefit rather than harm. Yet the very act of treating her as a stake in their gambling dispute felt like a betrayal of everything he'd been taught about respecting women and protecting those in need of assistance. The contradiction between helping her through winning and harming her through the mere act of playing created a moral knot that seemed impossible to untangle in the time available for decision. The storm outside reached a new level of intensity, with wind howling around the building's corners and rain hammering the roof with increasing force. Several men glanced nervously toward the ceiling, wondering whether the old structure would withstand the assault. The sound of the weather seemed to underscore the urgency of Sister Catherine's housing situation, adding natural pressure to the social and psychological forces already at work. Sister Catherine herself seemed unaware of the specific nature of the debate she had unwittingly inspired, though her intelligent eyes missed little of the tension crackling between Bull and Blackwood. Years of working in challenging environments had taught her to read social undercurrents quickly and accurately, and she clearly sensed that her welfare had somehow become entangled with the poker game's outcome. Bull's weathered hands trembled slightly as he held his cards, not from fear of losing money but from the weight of moral responsibility that Blackwood had so skillfully transferred to his shoulders. The land baron's manipulation had succeeded in making Bull feel personally responsible for Sister Catherine's comfort and safety, even though he'd played no role in creating her housing difficulties. The moment stretched toward its inevitable conclusion as Bull realized that any decision he made would carry consequences extending far beyond the poker table. Refusing to play would mean walking away from a winning hand, and potentially leaving Sister Catherine to suffer through the storm in inadequate shelter. Playing would mean accepting Blackwood's unconscionable terms, and treating a woman of God as if she were property to be wagered. "All right, Blackwood," Bull said finally, his voice heavy with reluctant resignation. "One hand for everything on the table, but understand this clearly, if I win, Sisters
Catherine gets offered proper shelter with full respect for her position and vows. Nothing more, nothing less than Christian hospitality.
The crowd released a collective breath as the decision was made, though few seemed entirely comfortable with the compromise that had been reached. Blackwood's smile widened with satisfaction at having successfully manipulated his opponent into accepting terms that should have been unthinkable to any decent man. Part 3. The Unexpected Encounter and Reality Check. The cards fell like autumn leaves in the sudden silence that followed Bull's acceptance of Blackwood's unconscionable wager. Bull's 3 queens faced down Blackwood's pair of jacks, bringing the most morally complex poker game in Crosswinds history to its inevitable conclusion. The pot, now including responsibility for Sister Catherine's welfare, passed to the gentle giant who had never wanted to win anything less in his entire life. Blackwood's face contorted with rage and disbelief as he stared at the losing hand that would cost him more than money and property. His carefully orchestrated humiliation of the simple cowboy had backfired spectacularly, leaving him not only financially damaged but publicly diminished in front of the very community he sought to dominate. The land baron's reputation for invincibility lay in ruins alongside his scattered cards. Bull gathered his winnings with mechanical precision, his mind already racing ahead to the unprecedented situation that victory had created. The money and property deeds meant little compared to the human responsibility he'd accidentally acquired through Blackwood's manipulation. How did a man approach a woman of God to explain that he'd won the right to offer her shelter through a gambling wager? The very concept seemed to violate every principle of decent behavior he'd been raised to follow. Sister Catherine had witnessed the poker game's conclusion from near the saloon's entrance, though the specific terms of the wager remained mysterious to her. She could see that Bull had won decisively and that Blackwood appeared devastated by his loss, but the crowd's strange mixture of relief and discomfort suggested there were dimensions to the victory she didn't yet understand. Her years in religious service had taught her to be suspicious of situations where her welfare became the subject of intense masculine attention. The storm outside had reached its full fury while the poker game played out, with wind and rain battering the saloon's windows like an army attempting siege. Lightning illuminated the desert landscape in brilliant flashes, revealing a world transformed by nature's violence into something alien and threatening. The temperature had dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the glass despite the late autumn date. Bull approached Sister Catherine with the hesitant steps of a man walking toward his own execution. His massive frame seemed diminished by the moral weight of what he needed to explain, and his usual confident bearing gave way to something approaching genuine fear. How did someone admit to a nun that she'd become the subject of a gambling wager, even one intended to benefit her? Sister Catherine, he began, his deep voice barely audible above the storm's roar, I need to speak with you about something important. Something that happened tonight that affects your situation here in Crosswinds. Sister Catherine studied his face with the penetrating gaze that had made her effective in dozens of challenging missionary assignments. She could see genuine distress in his expression rather than the calculating interest she'd learned to recognize in men who viewed her religious vocation as either a challenge to overcome or an obstacle to circumvent. Whatever Bull needed to discuss clearly caused him significant moral discomfort. I'm listening, Mr. Coleman, she replied, her voice calm despite the obvious tension radiating from the large cowboy. Years of dealing with frontier communities had taught her that crisis often revealed both the best and worst aspects of human nature, and tonight clearly qualified as some sort of crisis. Bull glanced around the saloon, acutely aware that their conversation was being observed by dozens of curious eyes. The crowd that had witnessed the poker game's conclusion seemed reluctant to disperse, perhaps sensing that the evening's drama had not yet reached its final act. Some faces showed genuine concern for Sister Catherine's welfare, while others displayed the ugly fascination of spectators eager to witness scandal unfold. Perhaps we could speak privately, Bull suggested, indicating a small alcove near the saloon's back wall where they might have some protection from prying eyes and ears. What I need to explain is complicated, and I'd rather not have the whole town listening in. Sister Catherine nodded and followed him to the relative privacy of the alcove, her movements betraying none of the wariness she undoubtedly felt. The nun's willingness to trust a virtual stranger demonstrated either remarkable courage or dangerous naivety, though Bull suspected it was the former rather than the latter. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone accustomed to navigating difficult situations with intelligence and dignity. The alcove provided minimal privacy, but it was better than conducting their conversation in full view of the assembled crowd. Bull struggled to find words that could adequately explain the evening's events without making himself sound like either a fool or a scoundrel. How did someone confess to treating another human being as gambling stakes, even with the best of intentions? Sister, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound improper and probably offensive, Bull began, his hands twisting his hat brim into tortured shapes. But I need you to understand that my intentions were good even if my methods were questionable. Sister Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent, allowing him to struggle through his explanation at his own pace. Her experience in religious counseling had taught her that people often needed time to work up courage for difficult confessions, and rushing them typically led to incomplete or misleading accounts of troubling situations. Bull took a deep breath and plunged ahead with his explanation. Vincent Blackwood was losing money to me at poker, and when he ran out of cash he proposed a different kind of wager. He suggested that if I won I'd be obligated to offer you proper shelter for the night. Said it would be Christian charity given the storm and your current housing situation. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire, toxic and impossible to ignore. Sister Catherine's face remained composed, but Bull could see her mind working rapidly to process the implications of what he'd revealed. The idea that two men had discussed her welfare as if it were property to be wagered, clearly struck her as both offensive and deeply troubling. I see, Sister Catherine said finally, her voice carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside, and you accepted this wager. Bull felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the cool air seeping through the saloon's walls. I didn't want to, sister, the whole idea went against everything I believe about treating women with respect. But Blackwood made it seem like refusing would mean leaving you to suffer in that cold storage room during the storm. Sister Catherine's expression shifted from controlled anger to something approaching understanding as she began to grasp the psychological manipulation that had led to Bull's decision. Her years of working with troubled individuals had familiarized her with the kinds of verbal traps that exploited people's best instincts for malicious purposes. She could see that Bull had been maneuvered into an impossible position where both playing and refusing to play carried moral consequences he found unacceptable. Mr. Blackwood has a reputation for such manipulations, she said quietly. I've encountered his type before in other communities, men who use others' decency as a weapon against them. Bull felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized that Sister Catherine understood the true nature of what had transpired. Her response demonstrated both intelligence and compassion, recognizing that he'd been victimized by Blackwood's psychological coercion rather than willing participant in something inappropriate. I won the hand, Bull continued, feeling compelled to complete his confession, which means I'm supposed to offer you shelter tonight, but I want you to know that it would be proper shelter, with full respect for your vows and position. Nothing inappropriate would happen or even be suggested. Sister Catherine studied his face with renewed intensity, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw instead was genuine moral distress and a desperate desire to do the right thing in a situation where right and wrong had become hopelessly tangled. Her assessment of his character began shifting from suspicion towards something approaching respect. The storm outside seemed to underscore the urgency of their situation as thunder shook the building and rain continued its relentless assault on the windows. Several other patrons glanced nervously toward the ceiling, clearly wondering whether the aging structure would withstand nature's onslaught. The temperature had dropped so dramatically that even inside the heated saloon, breath was beginning to form small clouds of vapor. Where exactly would this shelter be located? Sister Catherine asked, her tone suggesting she was considering the practical aspects of the situation rather than rejecting the offer outright. Bull's relief at her apparent willingness to listen grew stronger. I have a cabin about half a mile from here, built it myself 3 years ago when I decided to settle in Crosswinds permanently. 2 rooms, a good stove and solid walls that'll keep out the wind and rain. You'd have the back bedroom to yourself and I'd sleep in the front room by the fire. Sister Catherine's mind raced through the implications and alternatives available to her. The chapel storage room where she'd been staying was little more than a closet with stone walls and no source of heat beyond what leaked through from the main sanctuary. During previous storms she'd spent miserable nights wrapped in every blanket she owned, still shivering with cold that penetrated to her bones. The practical considerations warred with the social and religious implications of accepting shelter from a man she barely knew. While Bull's demeanor suggested genuine respect for her position, accepting his offer would certainly create gossip and possibly scandal that could undermine her effectiveness in establishing the mission school. Yet refusing might mean suffering through a dangerous storm that could threaten her health or even her life. This is highly irregular, Mr. Coleman, Sister Catherine said finally. My vows and position require me to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Spending a night under the same roof as an unmarried man would certainly raise questions about my judgment and character. Bull nodded soberly, understanding the dilemma her religious obligations created. I know it's not ideal, sister, but the storm's getting worse by the minute, and that storage room ain't fit for human habitation during weather like this. Sometimes doing what's safe has to take priority over what's conventional. Sister Catherine looked toward the windows where lightning continued to illuminate the desert landscape in apocalyptic flashes. The storm showed no signs of abating, and if anything appeared to be intensifying as the night wore on. She'd survived difficult conditions in previous missionary assignments, but the Nevada mountains presented unique challenges that her experience in other regions hadn't prepared her to handle. If I were to accept your offer, she said carefully, it would be strictly as emergency shelter during dangerous weather, nothing more than Christian charity towards someone in need. Bull felt another surge of relief as he realized she was seriously considering his proposal. That's exactly what it would be, sister. Emergency shelter with complete respect for your position and vows. You have my word as a gentleman and a Christian that nothing inappropriate would happen or be suggested. Sister Catherine studied his face once more, looking for any sign that his assurances were less than completely sincere. What she saw instead was a man genuinely concerned for her welfare, who had been manipulated into an uncomfortable situation by someone else's malice. Her assessment of Bull's character had evolved considerably during their brief conversation, shifting from suspicion toward cautious trust. The crowd in the main saloon area had begun to disperse as the evening's entertainment reached its conclusion, but several men lingered near the bar, obviously hoping to overhear the conversation between Bull and Sister Catherine. The outcome of their discussion would certainly become the subject of intense gossip throughout Crosswinds, regardless of what decision was ultimately reached. Murphy, the Irish bartender, approached their alcove with obvious concern etched across his weathered features. 20 years of frontier experience had taught him to recognize when situations were heading toward trouble, and something about the evening's events suggested complications that extended beyond simple gambling disputes. "Begging your pardon," Murphy said quietly, "but the storm's getting worse by the minute. Roads will be impassable soon, and anyone caught out in this weather might not make it to morning. Whatever you folks decide, you'd better decide quick." His words carried the authority of someone who'd witnessed the deadly potential of mountain storms firsthand. The urgency in his voice seemed to galvanize Sister Catherine's decision-making process, forcing her to choose between imperfect alternatives before nature made the choice for her. Sister Catherine looked once more toward the windows where the storm continued its assault on the human world, then back toward Bull's anxious face. The moral complexity of the situation was undeniable, but sometimes survival required accepting help from unexpected sources, even when that acceptance carried social risks. "Very well, Mr. Coleman," she said finally. "I'll accept your offer of emergency shelter with the understanding that it's nothing more than Christian charity during dangerous weather." Bull's massive frame seemed to sag with relief as the weight of responsibility he'd carried since winning the poker hand finally lifted from his shoulders. The evening's events had tested his character in ways he'd never anticipated, forcing him to navigate between competing moral obligations in a situation where no perfect solution existed. Part 4, Social Rejection and Mounting Opposition. The journey from the Silver Dollar Saloon to Bull's cabin became an ordeal that neither he nor Sister Catherine would ever forget. The storm had transformed the familiar streets of Crosswinds into an alien landscape of rushing water and debris, where every step forward required battling against wind that seemed determined to drive them back into the desert. Bull's massive frame provided some protection for Sister Catherine as they struggled through the tempest, but even his strength proved barely adequate against nature's fury. Sister Catherine pulled her cloak tighter against the driving rain that seemed to find every gap in her modest clothing. Her practical boots, adequate for normal walking, offered little protection against the ankle-deep streams that had formed in the town's previously dusty streets. Within minutes of leaving the saloon, both travelers were soaked to the skin despite their attempts to find shelter under building overhangs and covered walkways. The wind carried more than rain and debris. It seemed to howl with malicious intent as if the very elements had conspired to make their journey as miserable as possible. Lightning continued to illuminate the landscape in brilliant flashes that revealed a world transformed by the storm's violence. Trees that had stood for decades bent nearly horizontal under the wind's assault, while loose objects flew through the air like projectiles launched from some invisible siege engine. Bull's cabin, when they finally reached it, appeared as a beacon of hope in the chaotic darkness. The solid log construction he'd completed with his own hands 3 years earlier proved its worth as the storm battered against walls that remained steadfast despite nature's assault. The small structure seemed almost cozy compared to the apocalyptic conditions they'd endured during their journey from town. Inside, the cabin revealed Bull's character through its modest but careful appointments. The front room contained simple furniture built for durability rather than elegance, with a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall and promised warmth against the mountain cold. Books lined a rough-hewn shelf, more volumes than most cowboys would own, suggesting depths to Bull's character that casual acquaintances might not suspect. Sister Catherine examined her temporary shelter with the critical eye of someone accustomed to making the best of challenging accommodations. The cabin was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, with none of the bachelor squalor she might have expected from an unmarried cowboy's dwelling. A Bible rested on the kitchen table beside writing materials, indicating that Bull's claims to Christian faith were more than mere social convention. "The back bedroom is yours," Bull said, indicating a doorway that led to the cabin's second room. "I'll sleep out here by the fire to keep it fed through the night. Storm like this, we'll need steady heat to stay comfortable." Sister Catherine peered into the offered room and found it simply but adequately furnished with a narrow bed, small dresser and single chair. A window looked out toward the mountains, though currently it revealed nothing but darkness punctuated by lightning flashes. The space was modest but private, offering the separation necessary to maintain propriety despite their unusual circumstances. "This is very generous, Mr. Coleman," Sister Catherine said, removing her sodden cloak and hanging it near the fireplace to dry. "I'm grateful for your hospitality during such terrible weather." Bull busied himself building up the fire, using the activity to mask his nervousness about the unprecedented situation. Having a woman in his cabin, especially a nun, created social implications that made him profoundly uncomfortable despite the innocent nature of their arrangement. He could already imagine the gossip that would spread through Crosswinds once word of Sister Catherine's overnight stay became public knowledge. The storm outside continued its assault on the cabin with undiminished fury, rattling windows and causing the walls to creak under the pressure of wind gusts that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Both occupants found themselves grateful for the solid construction that kept the elements at bay, even as they worried about what the morning would reveal about the storm's damage to the surrounding community. Sister Catherine accepted Bull's offer of coffee and dry clothing, though the latter required creative solutions given the difference in their sizes. Bull's spare shirt, when belted at the waist, provided adequate coverage while her own garments dried by the fire. The domestic intimacy of sharing coffee and borrowed clothing would have been scandalous under normal circumstances, but the storm had temporarily suspended normal social conventions in favor of basic survival. As the night wore on, their conversation revealed unexpected depths in both characters. Bull's collection of books indicated an education that extended far beyond what most cowboys possessed, while Sister Catherine's knowledge of frontier conditions suggested experiences that went well beyond typical religious training. They discovered mutual interests in literature, philosophy and the challenges of building communities in harsh environments. Bull learned that Sister Catherine had chosen religious life not from lack of other options, but from genuine conviction that her talents could best serve humanity through missionary work. Her decision had cost her relationships with family members who'd expected her to marry and provide grandchildren, creating a loneliness that she'd learned to carry with quiet dignity. Sister Catherine discovered that Bull's gentle nature masked a complex intelligence and deep commitment to justice that had led him to champion unpopular causes in previous communities. His size and strength could have made him a bully, but instead he'd consistently used his physical advantages to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The storm began to abate near dawn, though wind and rain continued with enough intensity to make travel inadvisable for several more hours. Both Bull and Sister Catherine had dozed fitfully in their respective spaces, awakening frequently to check the fire and listen to the weather's progress. Neither had slept well, partly due to the storm's noise and partly due to anxiety about how their unusual arrangement would be perceived by the Crosswinds community. When morning finally arrived, it brought crisp autumn air and brilliant sunshine that seemed almost mockingly cheerful after the previous night's violence. The landscape revealed by daylight showed extensive storm damage, with fallen trees, debris-filled streets, and several buildings that had suffered significant structural harm. The creek that normally trickled through town had become a raging torrent that would remain dangerous for days. Bull and Sister Catherine emerged from the cabin to find a world transformed by nature's assault. Their journey back to town would require careful navigation around obstacles and flooded areas, but the most challenging aspect of their return would be facing a community that had undoubtedly spent the night speculating about their activities. The walk back to Crosswinds revealed the storm's impact on both the physical and social landscape. Several residents were already surveying damage to their properties, and the conversations died away abruptly when Bull and Sister Catherine appeared together on the main street. The sight of the nun emerging from the direction of Bull's cabin, wearing clothes that were obviously not her own, created exactly the kind of scandal that both had hoped to avoid. Mrs. Martha Webb, owner of the general store and unofficial guardian of Crosswinds' moral standards, observed their approach with undisguised disapproval. Her expression suggested that she'd already reached conclusions about the previous night's activities that bore little resemblance to the innocent reality of emergency shelter during dangerous weather. Well, Mrs. Webb announced loudly enough for nearby residents to hear. Seems our missionary sister has found more comfortable accommodations than the chapel storage room. How convenient that Mr. Coleman was available to provide such Christian hospitality. The words dripped with implications that both Bull and Sister Catherine found deeply offensive. Mrs. Webb's tone suggested activities that violated every principle both of them held sacred, turning their struggle for survival during the storm into something tawdry and shameful. Sister Catherine's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but years of dealing with hostile communities had taught her to maintain dignity in the face of unfair accusations. Mr. Coleman provided emergency shelter during dangerous weather, Mrs. Webb. Nothing more and nothing less than what Christian charity demanded under the circumstances. Mrs. Webb's response demonstrated the kind of small-minded malice that often flourished in isolated communities where gossip served as primary entertainment. "Oh, I'm sure that's what you'd call it, dear. Though some might wonder why a woman devoted to God would find it necessary to spend the night alone with an unmarried man, storm or no storm." Bull's massive hands clenched into fists as his temper began to rise. The implied insult to Sister Catherine's character struck him as unforgivable, especially given her genuine need for shelter during the previous night's dangerous conditions. "Mrs. Webb, I'd suggest you be more careful about spreading gossip that damages a good woman's reputation," but Mrs. Webb had tasted blood and seemed determined to press her advantage. "Good woman, Mr. Coleman, I'm sure you're qualified to judge such things, given your extensive experience with the sister's character." The confrontation was drawing attention from other townspeople, who gathered to witness what promised to become a memorable scandal. Some faces showed genuine concern for Sister Catherine's welfare, while others displayed the ugly fascination of people eager to believe the worst about their neighbors. Jake Morrison, Sister Catherine's estranged brother, approached the growing crowd with obvious reluctance. His position as ranch foreman had given him standing in the community, but his complicated relationship with his sister made the current situation particularly difficult to navigate. He'd spent years disapproving of her religious choices, but seeing her subjected to public humiliation awakened protective instincts he'd thought long buried. "That's enough, Martha," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Whatever happened last night, it's none of our business unless someone was harmed, and I don't see any evidence that anyone was harmed." Mrs. Webb turned her malicious attention toward Jake with obvious relish. "Oh, protecting your sister now, are you? Interesting how family loyalty appears when scandal threatens the Morrison name." The barb hit its target, reminding everyone present of the estrangement between Jake and Sister Catherine that had provided gossip material for months. Jake's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, other voices began joining the confrontation. "Woman needed shelter during the storm," called out Murphy from the saloon's doorway. "Any decent person would have offered help under those circumstances." "Decent people find appropriate shelter," Mrs. Webb shot back. "They don't spend nights alone with men they barely know, nun's habit or no nun's habit." The crowd's mood began to polarize as residents chose sides in the developing conflict. Some supported Bull and Sister Catherine's version of events, recognizing that the storm had created emergency conditions that suspended normal social conventions. Others aligned with Mrs. Webb's interpretation, viewing the overnight stay as evidence of moral failing that confirmed their suspicions about having a Catholic nun in their Protestant community. Sheriff Samuel Rodriguez arrived to investigate reports of a disturbance, though his weathered face suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than mediating a dispute about religious and sexual morality. 20 years of frontier law enforcement had taught him that such conflicts rarely ended well for anyone involved regardless of the underlying facts. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sheriff Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be both complicated and unpleasant. Mrs. Webb eagerly launched into her version of events, emphasizing details that cast Sister Catherine and Bull's behavior in the most unfavorable possible light. Her account transformed emergency shelter during dangerous weather into something approaching a romantic liaison, complete with implications that both parties had violated their stated moral principles. Sister Catherine listened to the character assassination with growing anger, but her religious training helped her maintain composure in the face of malicious gossip. She'd encountered similar situations in previous missionary assignments, where small-minded individuals had attempted to undermine her effectiveness through scandal and innuendo. Bull's temper, however, was reaching its breaking point. The confrontation in Crosswinds Main Street had drawn nearly every resident from their storm-damaged homes, creating an impromptu tribunal where Sister Catherine's reputation hung in the balance. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across faces that revealed the deep divisions within the community, as neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a moral chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Sheriff Rodriguez studied the assembled crowd with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades managing frontier disputes. The weathered lawman could see that this confrontation had moved beyond simple gossip into something more dangerous, where reputations could be permanently destroyed and community bonds irreparably damaged. His experience told him that such situations required careful handling to prevent escalation into violence. Bull's massive frame trembled with barely controlled rage as he listened to Mrs. Webb's poisonous interpretation of the previous night's events. The woman's ability to transform an act of Christian charity into something sordid and shameful struck him as a profound violation of everything decent people should believe about their neighbors. Her words wounded him deeply, but they wounded Sister Catherine more, and that was unforgivable. Sister Catherine herself stood with quiet dignity despite the character assassination being conducted in full view of the entire community. Years of missionary work had exposed her to every variety of human malice and petty cruelty, but something about this particular attack felt especially vicious. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Webb seemed to take personal pleasure in destroying another woman's reputation, or perhaps it was the realization that accepting help during an emergency had somehow been transformed into evidence of moral failing. The crowd's energy continued to build as more residents arrived to witness the spectacle. Some came out of genuine concern for the parties involved, while others were drawn by the magnetic pull of scandal that promised to provide gossip material for months to come. The storm's aftermath had left everyone with damaged property and disrupted routines, creating a restless mood that made the community particularly susceptible to the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that Mrs. Webb specialized in providing. Young Tommy Chen pushed through the crowd with his wife Sarah close behind, both of them clearly disturbed by the ugly turn the morning had taken. The couple had spent their wedding night huddled in their small apartment above the general store, listening to the storm's fury and worrying about friends and neighbors who might be facing dangerous conditions. The idea that someone who'd provided emergency shelter was being vilified for their kindness struck them as fundamentally wrong. Sarah Chen stepped forward with the courage that often surprised people who knew her only as a quiet store clerk's wife. Her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd as she addressed Mrs. Webb directly, challenging the moral authority that the older woman had claimed for herself. "Mrs. Webb, I think you're being unfair to Sister Catherine and Mr. Coleman," Sarah said, her words causing several conversations to stop abruptly. "The storm last night was the worst I've ever seen, and anyone caught outside could have died. If Mr. Coleman hadn't offered shelter, we might be planning a funeral instead of having this argument." Mrs. Webb turned her attention towards Sarah with obvious displeasure, clearly irritated that her moral crusade was being challenged by someone she'd previously dismissed as insignificant. The general store owner's face flushed with anger as she prepared to extend her character assassination to include anyone who dared question her interpretation of events. "My dear girl, you're too young and naive to understand the implications of what happened," Mrs. Webb replied with condescending sweetness that barely concealed her venom. "When a woman abandons proper behavior even under difficult circumstances, she opens herself to questions about her character and judgment." Sarah's husband Tommy moved to stand beside his wife, offering silent support for her courageous intervention. The young man's face showed determination despite his obvious nervousness about confronting one of Crosswinds' most influential residents. His presence seemed to strengthen Sarah's resolve as she prepared to continue her defense of Sister Catherine and Bull. "I understand perfectly well what happened," Sarah shot back, her voice gaining strength from her conviction. "Two decent people helped each other survive dangerous weather, and now small-minded gossips are trying to turn that into something shameful. If that's what passes for Christian behavior in this community, then maybe we need to examine our own consciences instead of attacking others. The exchange between Sarah and Mrs. Webb had shifted the crowd's attention away from Sister Catherine and Bull, providing them with a momentary respite from the intense scrutiny they'd been enduring. Both seemed grateful for Sarah's intervention, though they remained acutely aware that their reputations continued to hang in the balance of public opinion. Father Miguel Santos arrived at the scene with the measured pace of someone accustomed to mediating disputes within his parish. The elderly priest had served frontier communities for over 30 years, encountering every variety of human conflict and moral complexity that such environments could produce. His weathered face showed concern rather than surprise at finding his newest missionary embroiled in controversy. The priest's arrival seemed to calm some of the crowd's more aggressive energy, as even Mrs. Webb hesitated to continue her attack in the presence of religious authority. Father Santos' reputation for wisdom and fairness had earned him respect throughout the territory, making his opinion on the current dispute potentially decisive in determining its outcome. Perhaps we should all take a moment to consider what we're really discussing here, Father Santos said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to guiding troubled souls. A storm threatened our community last night, and people helped each other survive. That seems like cause for gratitude rather than suspicion. Mrs. Webb's face showed frustration at the priest's intervention, but she was too politically astute to directly challenge religious authority in front of a crowd that included many of his parishioners. Instead, she shifted her tactics toward more subtle implications that wouldn't put her in direct conflict with Father Santos while still advancing her campaign against Sister Catherine. Of course, Father, we're all grateful that everyone survived the storm safely, Mrs. Webb said with false piety. But surely you understand that appearances matter, especially for those in religious service. When a nun spends the night alone with an unmarried man, regardless of the circumstances, it raises questions that affect the entire community's faith. Father Santos studied Mrs. Webb's face with the penetrating gaze he'd developed through decades of hearing confessions and counseling troubled parishioners. The priest's expression suggested that he saw through her rhetorical manipulation to the petty malice that motivated her attack on Sister Catherine's character. Mrs. Webb, in my experience, faith is strengthened by witnessing acts of charity, and weakened by witnessing unkindness toward those who serve others, Father Santos replied calmly. Sister Catherine has dedicated her life to helping people, often in difficult and dangerous circumstances. If we punish such dedication with suspicion and gossip, what message does that send about our own values? The priest's words carried weight with many community members who had previously remained silent during the confrontation. Several residents began nodding in agreement, recognizing the truth in Father Santos' observation about the dangerous precedent being set by Mrs. Webb's attack on Sister Catherine. Bull found his voice returning as he witnessed the gradual shift in crowd sentiment that Father Santos' intervention had created. The massive cowboy's anger remained strong, but he channeled it into a defense of Sister Catherine that focused on facts rather than emotions. Father Santos is right, Bull said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Sister Catherine needed shelter during dangerous weather, and I provided it with complete respect for her position and vows. Anyone who suggests otherwise is spreading lies that damage a good woman's reputation. Mrs. Webb sensed that public opinion was beginning to turn against her, and she made one final attempt to salvage her moral crusade by appealing to the crowd's religious prejudices. Her strategy involved questioning not just Sister Catherine's behavior, but her fitness to serve in a predominantly Protestant community. Perhaps the real question, Mrs. Webb announced with renewed confidence, is whether someone whose judgment leads them into such questionable situations is truly qualified to guide our children's education. Do we really want someone who makes such poor decisions teaching our young people about proper behavior? The attack on Sister Catherine's professional qualifications represented a new level of malice that shocked even some of Mrs. Webb's previous supporters. The suggestion that emergency shelter during a dangerous storm somehow disqualified someone from teaching revealed the depth of prejudice that had motivated the entire confrontation. Jake Morrison had remained silent throughout most of the dispute, torn between his protective instincts toward his sister and his own complicated feelings about her religious choices. But Mrs. Webb's attack on Sister Catherine's qualifications as an educator finally pushed him beyond his tolerance for the community's treatment of his family member. "That's enough, Martha," Jake said firmly, stepping forward to place himself between Mrs. Webb and his sister. "Whatever personal issues I might have with Catherine's choices, I won't stand by and watch you destroy her reputation based on gossip and speculation." The intervention by Jake Morrison carried particular weight because everyone present knew about the long-standing estrangement between the siblings. His willingness to defend Sister Catherine despite their personal conflicts demonstrated that even family members who disagreed with her choices recognized the fundamental unfairness of the attack being mounted against her. Mrs. Webb's face showed shock and anger at Jake's unexpected intervention. She'd clearly counted on his continued silence or even support for her campaign against his sister, and his defense of Sister Catherine represented a significant setback to her efforts to isolate the nun from community support. Jake Morrison, I'm surprised at you, Mrs. Webb said with obvious disappointment. I thought you of all people would understand the importance of maintaining proper standards in our community. Jake's weathered face hardened as he recognized the implication that his sister's presence somehow lowered the community's moral standards. The ranch foreman had spent years building his reputation through hard work and fair dealing, and he wouldn't allow anyone to suggest that his family brought shame to Crosswinds. My sister has higher moral standards than most people in this crowd, Jake replied with conviction that surprised even himself. If offering emergency shelter during a dangerous storm is somehow improper, then maybe we need to reconsider what we mean by Christian behavior. The confrontation seemed to reach a turning point as more voices began speaking in support of Sister Catherine and Bull. The storm's aftermath had reminded many residents of their dependence on each other for survival, making Mrs. Webb's attack on charitable behavior seem particularly inappropriate and dangerous. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the town's physician, arrived at the scene after completing her initial assessment of storm-related injuries throughout the community. The middle-aged woman had earned universal respect through her skill and dedication, making her opinion on medical and moral matters particularly influential among Crosswinds residents. I've just finished checking on storm victims throughout town, Dr. Hayes announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent the night saving lives. 3 people nearly died from exposure, and 2 more suffered serious injuries from flying debris. Anyone who provided shelter during that storm deserves our gratitude, not our suspicion. The physician's testimony about the storm's actual dangers provided crucial context for evaluating Sister Catherine and Bull's actions the previous night. Her words reminded the crowd that they were discussing a genuine emergency situation rather than a social gathering where normal conventions should have applied. Mrs. Webb made one last desperate attempt to maintain her position by appealing to abstract principles rather than specific circumstances. Her strategy involved invoking traditional values that many frontier communities held sacred, regardless of their practical application to particular situations. Dr. Hayes, no one questions the importance of helping during emergencies, Mrs. Webb said with forced reasonableness. But surely we can provide such help without compromising the moral standards that hold our community together. There must have been other options available that wouldn't have created such complications. Dr. Hayes studied Mrs. Webb with the clinical detachment she typically reserved for particularly unpleasant medical cases. The physician's expression suggested that she found the general store owner's moral posturing both hypocritical and potentially dangerous to community welfare. Mrs. Webb, during medical emergencies we focus on saving lives rather than preserving social conventions, Dr. Hayes replied with professional authority. Anyone who suggests that Sister Catherine should have risked death to avoid gossip has seriously misplaced priorities. The physician's blunt assessment of Mrs. Webb's position seemed to crystallize public opinion in favor of Sister Catherine and Bull. The crowd's energy shifted from hostile curiosity to something approaching shame as residents began to recognize the unfairness of the attack they'd witnessed. Sister Catherine finally spoke for herself, having allowed others to defend her character while she observed the community's response to the crisis. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to addressing hostile audiences, developed through years of missionary work in challenging environments. I appreciate everyone who has spoken in defense of Mr. Coleman and myself, Sister Catherine said, her words carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. But I think we're missing the larger lesson of last night's events. When crisis strikes, we discover who we really are as individuals and as a community. Some people respond with kindness and generosity, while others respond with suspicion and malice. Her words seemed to penetrate the crowd's consciousness in a way that direct defense hadn't achieved. By focusing attention on the community's response rather than her own actions, Sister Catherine forced residents to examine their own behavior and motivations. Mr. Coleman risked his own reputation to ensure my safety during dangerous weather, Sister Catherine continued. Instead of celebrating such selfless behavior, some have chosen to transform it into something shameful. That choice reflects more on the accusers than on the accused. The crowd began to disperse as residents realized that the morning's confrontation had revealed uncomfortable truths about their own characters and values. Some departed with expressions of shame, while others seemed angry at having their prejudices exposed so publicly. Mrs. Webb found herself increasingly isolated as former supporters distanced themselves from her campaign against Sister Catherine. The general store owner's face showed bewilderment at the rapid shift in public opinion that had left her appearing petty and vindictive rather than morally righteous. Bull and Sister Catherine walked together toward the chapel, their shared ordeal having created a bond that transcended their different backgrounds and social positions. Both understood that the morning's events had changed their standing in the community, though whether for better or worse remained to be determined. Part 4. Social rejection and mounting opposition. The days following the storm and its aftermath brought subtle but persistent changes to life in Crosswinds that affected both Bull and Sister Catherine in ways they hadn't anticipated. While the dramatic confrontation in the town's main street had ended in their apparent vindication, the underlying tensions that Mrs. Webb had exploited didn't simply disappear with the crowd's dispersal. Instead, they festered beneath the surface of daily interactions, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and judgment that made normal activities increasingly uncomfortable. Sister Catherine discovered that her mission work had become significantly more challenging as families began questioning whether they wanted their children exposed to someone whose moral judgment had been publicly questioned. The fact that her defenders had prevailed in the street confrontation meant little to parents who harbored private doubts about having a Catholic nun educate their Protestant children. Mrs. Webb's poison had found fertile ground in the religious prejudices that many residents preferred to keep hidden from public view. The first indication of the changing atmosphere came when Sister Catherine visited the Henderson family to discuss enrolling their twin daughters in the proposed mission school. Martha Henderson, who had previously expressed enthusiasm for providing her children with formal education, suddenly seemed hesitant and evasive when the subject arose. "Well, sister, we've been thinking about the school situation," Mrs. Henderson said, avoiding direct eye contact while she bustled around her kitchen with unnecessary urgency. "Sam and I aren't sure this is the right time to start something new, what with all the storm damage and economic uncertainty." Sister Catherine recognized the polite deflection for what it was, having encountered similar responses in previous missionary assignments where community acceptance had proven elusive. The real objection had nothing to do with timing or economics and everything to do with doubts about her character and suitability as an educator. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Henderson," Sister Catherine replied diplomatically. "Perhaps when you've had more time to consider the matter we could discuss it again." But Mrs. Henderson's discomfort was obvious as she continued avoiding eye contact and finding excuses to busy herself with household tasks. The conversation that should have taken 30 minutes was concluded in less than 10, with Sister Catherine politely dismissed despite the family's previous enthusiasm for the educational opportunity. Similar scenes played out at other households throughout Crosswinds as Sister Catherine discovered that her support network had quietly evaporated in the wake of the storm controversy. Families who had previously welcomed her visits now seemed reluctant to be seen associating with someone whose reputation had been tainted by gossip and speculation. The Morrison family's reaction proved particularly painful because of Jake's public defense of his sister during the street confrontation. Despite his willingness to protect her from direct attack, Jake remained uncomfortable with the idea of closer association that might complicate his own standing in the community. "Catherine, I'm glad you're safe and I meant what I said about defending you from Martha Webb's nonsense," Jake said during an awkward conversation at his ranch. "But maybe it would be better if we kept our distance for a while, just until things settle down and people forget about all this controversy." The suggestion that her own brother thought association with her was dangerous stung Sister Catherine more deeply than the attacks from strangers. Jake's words reminded her of the family relationships she'd sacrificed when choosing religious life, and the ongoing cost of that decision in terms of personal isolation and loneliness. Bull's situation proved equally challenging as his professional relationships began suffering from the controversy surrounding his offer of shelter to Sister Catherine. Ranch owners who had previously competed for his services as a skilled horse trainer and ranch hand suddenly seemed less interested in his availability. The first concrete indication of his changing fortunes came when Tom Bradley, owner of the Circle B Ranch, canceled a lucrative contract for breaking and training a string of wild horses. Bradley's excuse involved cash flow problems and uncertainty about the local economy, but Bull suspected the real reason had more to do with his association with Sister Catherine. "Nothing personal, Bull," Bradley said with obvious discomfort during their meeting at the ranch's main house. It's just that business has been slow lately, and we need to cut expenses wherever possible. Maybe next season things will pick up again. But Bull noticed that Bradley had hired another horse trainer within days of canceling their contract, suggesting that economic concerns weren't the real motivation for the decision. The message was clear enough: association with scandal, even scandal that had been publicly debunked, carried professional consequences that prudent businessmen preferred to avoid. The pattern repeated itself at other ranches throughout the area as Bull discovered that his reputation for reliability and skill meant less than his perceived moral complications. Ranch owners who had previously valued his services began finding excuses to use other workers, creating an economic squeeze that threatened his ability to maintain his modest cabin and support himself. The social isolation extended beyond professional relationships into the daily interactions that made frontier life bearable. Both Bull and Sister Catherine found themselves excluded from the informal networks of conversation and mutual support that held small communities together during difficult times. At Murphy's saloon, Bull discovered that his presence created an uncomfortable silence that replaced the usual friendly banter among regular customers. Men who had previously included him in their conversations about weather, politics, and local events now seemed to find excuses to conduct their business elsewhere when he appeared. Murphy himself remained cordial but noticeably cooler than before the storm controversy. The Irish bartender's livelihood depended on maintaining good relationships with all his customers, and he couldn't afford to be seen as taking sides in a dispute that had divided the community. "Nothing personal, Bull," Murphy said quietly during one of their stilted interactions. "Just trying to keep the peace and avoid trouble. You understand how it is in a small town like this." Bull understood perfectly well how it was, which made the isolation no less painful. The same moral principles that had led him to offer shelter to Sister Catherine now prevented him from compromising those principles to regain social acceptance. He couldn't bring himself to denounce or distance himself from someone who had done nothing wrong except accept help during an emergency. Sister Catherine's situation at the chapel became increasingly untenable as Father Santos received pressure from territorial church authorities who had heard distorted versions of the storm controversy. While the elderly priest continued to support his missionary, he was forced to acknowledge that her effectiveness in Crosswinds had been severely compromised by the scandal. "I believe in your dedication and character, sister," Father Santos said during one of their private conversations, "but we must face reality about your ability to serve this community effectively. Sometimes the most faithful servants of God find themselves called to minister elsewhere." The suggestion that she might need to abandon her mission in Crosswinds struck Sister Catherine as a profound injustice, especially since she'd done nothing wrong beyond accepting emergency shelter during dangerous weather. The idea that malicious gossip could force her to abandon people who needed educational and spiritual services violated everything she believed about perseverance in the face of adversity. The economic pressure on Bull intensified as more ranch owners found excuses to avoid hiring someone whose reputation had been tainted by association with scandal. His savings dwindled rapidly as work opportunities disappeared, forcing him to consider whether he could afford to maintain his independence in Crosswinds. The situation reached a crisis point when Vincent Blackwood, the land speculator who had initiated the original poker game, began making inquiries about purchasing Bull's cabin and the small plot of land surrounding it. Blackwood's interest seemed motivated more by spite than genuine investment opportunity, representing an attempt to complete the humiliation that had begun with the poker wager. "Heard you might be having some financial difficulties, Coleman," Blackwood said with false sympathy during an unexpected visit to Bull's property. "Shame how quickly a man's circumstances can change when his reputation suffers. I might be willing to make a fair offer for your place, help you get a fresh start somewhere else." The offer was insultingly low, obviously designed to force Bull into a humiliating sale that would complete his social and economic destruction. Blackwood's smile suggested that he viewed the entire situation as delayed revenge for his poker loss and the public embarrassment that had followed. Bull's temper flared at the transparent attempt at manipulation, but his practical mind recognized the dangerous reality of his situation. Without steady work he couldn't afford to maintain his property indefinitely, and Blackwood's offer might represent his only option for avoiding complete financial ruin. "I'm not interested in selling, Blackwood," Bull replied with as much dignity as he could muster. "Especially not to someone who caused this whole mess with his gambling schemes." Blackwood's false sympathy disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation that characterized his business dealings. "Your choice, Coleman. But opportunities like this don't come along often, especially for someone in your complicated situation." The threat was clear enough,
accept the humiliating offer or face continued economic pressure until forced sale became inevitable. Blackwood had positioned himself to profit from the very controversy he'd created, adding insult to the injury he'd already inflicted. Sister Catherine's isolation deepened as even some of her previous defenders began distancing themselves from
someone whose presence seemed to create ongoing controversy. Sarah Chen, who had courageously spoken in her defense during the street confrontation, found herself pressured by her husband's employer to avoid further association with the controversial nun. "I'm sorry, sister," Sarah said with obvious regret during an uncomfortable conversation at the general store. "Tommy's boss made it clear that our family's economic security depends on avoiding involvement in community disputes. We can't afford to take risks with our livelihood." The young woman's distress was obvious as she explained the impossible choice between personal conscience and economic survival that many community members faced. Supporting Sister Catherine carried real costs that families with limited resources couldn't afford to bear, regardless of their private convictions about justice and fairness. Dr. Eleanor Hayes remained one of the few community leaders willing to maintain open association with Sister Catherine, but even the respected physician faced pressure to reconsider her position. Several prominent families threatened to seek medical care elsewhere if she continued defending someone whose moral judgment they questioned. "It's ridiculous and unfair," Dr. Hayes said during one of her private conversations with Sister Catherine, "but I'm being forced to choose between supporting you and maintaining my medical practice. In a community this small, losing even a few families as patients could destroy my ability to serve everyone else." The physician's dilemma illustrated the broader pattern of social pressure that was systematically isolating both Sister Catherine and Bull from the community they'd tried to serve. Even people who privately believed in their innocence found themselves unable to provide public support without risking their own social and economic standing. The cumulative effect of daily rejection and ostracism began taking a toll on both Sister Catherine and Bull that extended beyond material concerns to psychological and spiritual dimensions. The constant awareness of being watched, judged, and found wanting created a level of stress that made normal activities feel like performances under hostile scrutiny. Bull found himself second-guessing every interaction, wondering whether casual conversations would be misinterpreted as evidence of improper relationships or poor judgment. The simple act of greeting Sister Catherine on the street became fraught with implications that transformed normal courtesy into potentially dangerous behavior. Sister Catherine experienced similar stress as she realized that every aspect of her daily routine was being monitored and evaluated by people eager to find additional evidence of moral failing. The freedom to serve others effectively had been replaced by constant vigilance against providing ammunition for her critics. The psychological pressure was compounded by the knowledge that their situation was unlikely to improve without dramatic intervention. Small-town scandals had a tendency to perpetuate themselves through repetition and embellishment, creating permanent stains on reputations that time alone couldn't erase. Both Bull and Sister Catherine began considering whether they could continue living in Crosswinds under such conditions, or whether accepting defeat and leaving might be the only practical solution to their impossible situation. The idea of abandoning their home and mission represented a profound personal failure, but the alternative seemed to be indefinite isolation and gradual economic destruction. Part 5. Hidden Depths and Unexpected Competence. The transformation of Sister Catherine from controversial figure to essential community member began with a crisis that struck Crosswinds like a plague from biblical times. The first symptoms appeared in the Chen family's infant son, little David, who developed a fever that seemed immune to every traditional remedy his parents attempted. Within hours, the child's condition had deteriorated to a level that terrified his young parents and sent them seeking help from anyone who might possess medical knowledge. Dr. Eleanor Hayes was attending to storm victims in a neighboring settlement when David Chen's illness reached its crisis point, leaving Crosswinds without its primary medical authority during a moment of desperate need. Sarah Chen, remembering Sister Catherine's quiet confidence during previous conversations, made the desperate decision to seek help from someone the community had recently ostracized. "Sister Catherine, I know people have been saying terrible things about you, but my baby is dying and Dr. Hayes is gone," Sarah sobbed as she appeared at the chapel door with her fevered infant. "Please, if you know anything about medicine, help us. I don't care what anyone says about propriety or reputation." Sister Catherine took one look at the critically ill child and immediately recognized symptoms she'd encountered during previous missionary assignments in regions where medical care was scarce and disease was commonplace. Her years of training had prepared her for exactly this kind of emergency, though she'd hoped never to encounter such desperate circumstances in Crosswinds. "Bring him inside quickly," Sister Catherine said with authority that surprised Sarah. "We need to get his fever down immediately and address his dehydration before he goes into shock." Sister Catherine's transformation from embattled nun to confident medical practitioner revealed hidden depths that no one in Crosswinds had suspected. Her movements became precise and purposeful as she assessed the child's condition with the expertise of someone who dealt with similar crises many times before. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what I tell you," Sister Catherine instructed while examining the infant. "This looks like yellow fever, which I've treated before in southern settlements. It's dangerous but treatable if we act quickly and follow the proper protocols." Sarah's desperation overrode any concerns about Sister Catherine's qualifications or the social implications of accepting her help. The young mother watched with growing hope as the nun demonstrated medical knowledge that seemed both comprehensive and practical. Sister Catherine began implementing treatment procedures that revealed extensive training in frontier medicine, including techniques for managing fever, preventing dehydration, and monitoring vital signs that were not commonly known outside professional medical circles. Her confident handling of the medical emergency suggested experience that went far beyond basic first aid or amateur nursing. "Where did you learn to do this?" Sarah asked as she watched Sister Catherine prepare a carefully measured mixture of water, salt, and sugar designed to combat the dehydration that often proved fatal in yellow fever cases. "Dr. Marcus Wellington trained me during my missionary work in New Orleans," Sister Catherine replied while monitoring the infant's response to her treatments. "He was the finest physician in Louisiana, and he believed that missionaries serving remote communities needed proper medical education to save lives effectively." The revelation that Sister Catherine had received formal medical training from a respected physician transformed Sarah's understanding of who she was really dealing with. This wasn't simply a nun offering amateur comfort to a sick child, but someone with legitimate medical expertise addressing a serious disease. Word of Sister Catherine's medical intervention spread through Crosswinds with the speed that only genuinely important news could achieve in a small community. The same gossip network that had recently carried malicious speculation about her moral character now buzzed with reports of her unexpected medical competence. Tommy Chen, initially skeptical about his wife's decision to seek help from the controversial nun, became a vocal advocate for Sister Catherine's medical abilities as he witnessed his son's dramatic improvement under her care. The young father's relief at seeing his child recover from what had appeared to be a fatal illness overcame any concerns about social propriety or community opinion. "I don't care what anyone says about Sister Catherine," Tommy declared to anyone who would listen. "She saved my son's life when no one else knew what to do. That's all I need to know about her character." Bull learned about Sister Catherine's medical intervention from Murphy, who had heard the story from multiple sources and seemed genuinely impressed by her unexpected competence. The Irish bartender's respect for practical skills overrode his previous concerns about associating with controversial figures. "Never would have guessed she had that kind of training," Murphy admitted while cleaning glasses with unusual vigor. "Makes a man wonder what other talents people are hiding beneath their surface appearances." Bull's own perception of Sister Catherine began shifting as he realized that her calm confidence during the storm had reflected genuine competence rather than mere religious faith. The knowledge that she possessed medical skills that could save lives added new dimensions to his respect for her character and abilities. The successful treatment of David Chen's yellow fever proved to be only the beginning of Sister Catherine's medical practice in Crosswinds. Other families, emboldened by the Chen family's positive experience, began seeking her help for various ailments that had previously gone untreated due to Dr. Hayes's frequent absences on emergency calls to distant settlements. Mrs. Patterson arrived at the chapel 3 days after David Chen's recovery, carrying her elderly father who had been suffering from a persistent cough that was growing progressively worse. The old man's condition had reached a point where the family feared pneumonia or consumption, either of which could prove fatal without proper treatment. "Sister, I know we haven't been as welcoming as we should have been," Mrs. Patterson said with obvious embarrassment. "But Papa's getting worse every day, and Dr. Hayes won't be back for a week. Tommy Chen says you know real medicine, not just prayer and sympathy." Sister Catherine examined the elderly man with the same professional competence she'd displayed with the Chen infant, quickly diagnosing a respiratory infection that could be effectively treated with proper medication and care. Her ability to distinguish between serious and minor ailments demonstrated diagnostic skills that impressed even skeptical family members. "Mr. Patterson has acute bronchitis, which is serious but treatable," Sister Catherine explained while preparing herbal remedies that she'd learned to compound during her medical training. "He'll need rest, proper nutrition, and these medications administered at specific intervals. I'll check on him daily until the infection clears." The systematic approach Sister Catherine brought to medical treatment revealed organizational abilities that extended beyond her religious training. She maintained detailed records of patient symptoms, treatments administered, and recovery progress that demonstrated the kind of methodical thinking usually associated with formally trained physicians. Bull's own understanding of Sister Catherine's capabilities expanded when she offered to examine his injured mare, Thunder, who had been limping since the storm despite the local veterinarian's efforts to diagnose and treat the problem. Sister Catherine's willingness to apply her medical knowledge to animal care suggested a breadth of training that impressed the experienced horseman. Animals and humans aren't that different when it comes to basic anatomy and healing principles, Sister Catherine explained while examining Thunder's injured leg. Dr. Wellington insisted that his students understand comparative medicine because frontier practitioners often need to treat both people and livestock. Sister Catherine's diagnosis revealed a small bone fragment that the veterinarian had missed, lodged in a position where it was causing ongoing pain and limiting the horse's mobility. Her recommendation for a simple surgical procedure to remove the fragment demonstrated both diagnostic accuracy and surgical knowledge that surprised Bull. "You really think you can fix her?" Bull asked, his voice betraying the emotional attachment he felt to the injured mare. "I've performed similar procedures on humans and the anatomy is actually simpler in horses," Sister Catherine replied with confidence. Dr. Wellington made sure all his students could handle basic surgery because emergency operations often can't wait for specialists to arrive. The successful surgery on Thunder's leg provided dramatic proof of Sister Catherine's medical competence that impressed even her harshest critics. Bull's grateful testimonials about her skill and dedication began shifting community opinion among men who respected practical abilities regardless of their source. Jake Morrison, Sister Catherine's estranged brother, found his attitude toward his sister changing as reports of her medical successes accumulated throughout Crosswinds. The ranch foreman's practical nature appreciated competence and results, making it difficult to maintain his previous disapproval of her choices. "Never knew Catherine had learned real medicine," Jake admitted during a conversation with Bull at the general store. "Always thought she was just playing at being helpful with her religious work. Makes me wonder what else I missed about her capabilities." The revelation of Sister Catherine's medical training began attracting attention from surrounding communities where access to professional medical care was even more limited than in Crosswinds. Families from distant ranches and mining camps began making the journey to consult with the nun who had acquired a reputation for diagnostic accuracy and effective treatment. Dr. Eleanor Hayes returned from her emergency call to find that Sister Catherine had essentially taken over her practice during her absence and that patients were actively seeking the nun's care even when the physician was available. Rather than resenting the competition, Dr. Hayes found herself impressed by Sister Catherine's competence and grateful for the assistance. "Your medical knowledge is quite extensive," Dr. Hayes observed during their first professional consultation. "Where exactly did you receive your training?" Sister Catherine's explanation of her apprenticeship with Dr. Marcus Wellington in New Orleans revealed the depth and sophistication of her medical education. She'd spent 3 years working alongside one of the South's most respected physicians, learning not just basic care but advanced diagnostic techniques and surgical procedures that few frontier doctors possessed. Dr. Wellington believed that missionaries needed proper medical training to serve effectively in remote areas, Sister Catherine explained. He took on selected students who demonstrated aptitude and dedication regardless of their gender or religious affiliation. The partnership between Dr. Hayes and Sister Catherine that developed from their professional collaboration began transforming both women's effectiveness in serving the Crosswinds community. Hayes' formal medical credentials combined with Sister Catherine's extensive practical experience created a medical team capable of handling emergencies and complex cases that neither could manage alone. Bull's respect for Sister Catherine deepened as he witnessed her growing reputation as a medical practitioner throughout the region. The same qualities of intelligence, dedication, and moral courage that had attracted his initial admiration proved to be foundation stones for genuine professional competence that commanded respect from even former critics. Sister Catherine's medical practice also revealed organizational and leadership abilities that suggested she could have succeeded in many different fields had circumstances and social conventions been different. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.